everyone to the Institute for Middle East Options MENA Mix Regional Recap podcast. I'm Roberta Maggi, a development practitioner and consultant experienced in operationalizing international development assistance, program management, and technical analysis with a focus on North Africa and specifically Libya. Currently an associate fellow with CARPO and specializing in good governance, institutional reform, ceasefires, and security arrangements. I'm joined today by my wonderful co-host, Dr. Alia Brahimi. Alia is an analyst and scholar of international relations, specializing in morality and conflict, non-traditional combatants, and the Middle East and North Africa. She's currently a non-resident senior fellow with the Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., where she hosts the popular geopolitical podcast, Guns for Hire, focused on the resurgence of mercenaries globally. It's the end of November 2025. And as in previous editions of this podcast, we're here to walk you through the major developments that shaped the Middle East and North Africa this month. From escalating tensions in Lebanon and Gaza, the worsening conflict in Sudan, and new geopolitical rapprochement, we'll explore what happened, why it matters, and how it connects to the broader regional picture. Alia, we have a lot to cover today.
Yeah, we do, and thanks for having me. My head's exploding a little bit actually, as I'm more accustomed to just asking the questions on a podcast and without video. So this is a new frontier for me.
Let's see how we do. This is a first for me too. So I can't wait to delve into all of the discussions that we've planned for today with you and with our audience. But before we do that, I just want to thank the Institute for Middle East Options once more for also having me as the host of this month's episode. Let's delve straight into the thick of it, shall we? In Gaza, airstrikes have been resuming despite the ceasefire framework having been in place. More than 300 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli strikes since the ceasefire came into force, according to Gaza's health ministry. On November 19 and November 20th, Israeli airstrikes in Gaza killed dozens of civilians, including families sheltering in tents in Khan Yunis. On November the 22nd, the Israeli military said it had struck targets across northern and central Gaza in response to shot fired at soldiers after crossing the Strip's so-called Yellow Line, which was denied by Hamas, who accused Israel of being the one to violate the Yellow Line and conduct wet swords breaches with its military. These strikes and escalations occurred despite a ceasefire framework and ongoing negotiations involving outside mediators. The renewed strikes matter because they highlight the fragility of the ceasefire and the severity of the humanitarian conditions, while continuing to raise ethical questions about civilian casualties and proportionality in the use of force. And so, Alia, on this question, I turn to you. Why does the ceasefire remain unstable in your view?
Why are things unstable? Well, in terms of kind of like the superstructure, I think that the Trump plan is limited, in my view, and problematic, because it doesn't deal with a few things. It doesn't deal with the past in terms of accountability for war crimes, which is important because hundreds of thousands were either killed, maimed, or bereaved. And there was a catastrophic impact on young children in particular. So it's not only about justice, it's a question of trust and of values and of what international order or like moral vision this plan is representing. So the silence on accountability for what the IDF has wrought in Gaza is deafening, and I think that that's problematic. So that's the past. It also doesn't deal with the present. It talks about disarming Hamas with no political pathway as an alternative. You hear a lot about the IRA, FARC, the ANC, even the Jewish terrorist groups, the Lehi and the Irgun. But these groups all agreed to disarm, more or less, because there was the opportunity to become political stakeholders instead. And of course, that's been explicitly banned for Hamas. And the agreement also doesn't deal with the future, right? So there's no pathway to a two-state solution. It's only referenced vaguely in the plan, and there's no kind of US commitment to bring that about. So, is it ultimately putting lipstick on the continuation of the occupation, which is the structural driver of all of this? So, that's the sort of dubious context in my view. But in terms of like the quotidian reality, the Israeli violations continue to mount in terms of the bombing that you just described, not allowing unfettered humanitarian access, the refusal to allow any role for the PA or Fatah in Gaza, the fact that Israel is still occupying 58% of Gaza. So I think we have like another instance of this kind of you cease, I fire strategy from Israel. And I guess the Israeli government feels safe and cocooned in that kind of prevailing double standard. And because of that kind of suspension of the moral and legal rules, the deaths of these civilians, of these families, of these IDPs, the children, the babies, the toddlers, in this ceasefire phase, as before, they don't even seem to echo. There's no kind of like ripple in the matrix. It's just sort of bizarre. And anyone anywhere that cares about the laws of war or even the rule of law ought to be troubled by this drip feed of one-sided killing, as though it were baked into the ceasefire agreement somehow, kind of like scribbled in the margins as acceptable, or at least not fatal to the deal, as long as the deaths are Palestinian and not Israeli. But I'm sure there's a more technical answer out there somewhere.
I completely subscribe to everything you're raising. I'd perhaps had one element sort of from my experience with ceasefire agreements elsewhere, which is that traditionally ceasefire monitoring and verification are fully fledged mechanisms that take a long time to negotiate as part of bigger political agreements towards ending hostilities. And when it's done in their full right, they're usually implemented with third-party ceasefire monitors, with an entire oversight mechanism, with due reporting, with data collection, with significant resources being invested just in ceasefire monitoring and verification. And unfortunately, what I'm seeing with the Trump plan and with the ceasefire that's resulting is not necessarily the time invested to really create and think about what a fully fledged ceasefire monitoring and verification mechanism in Gaza would be. And this is not just sort of in a discussion for the long term, but also a discussion for the immediate short term, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think bothers me the most about how this has been executed is that both Hamas and Israel are almost left to police themselves in terms of the implementation of the ceasefire, or rather its violation, right? Which I think is highly problematic, especially for a conflict that, as you say, has its roots not just in October 7th, but in a broader, much longer historical context of occupation, and of sort of escalations and tensions over the years, and not just sort of 2023 until now. I wonder if you would think that there are any points of pressure for Israel and Netanyahu that could be used, not just perhaps to take us to ceasefire monitoring and verification mechanisms that are sort of more overseen and strongly backed internationally, but also in terms of national level politics in Gaza and in Israel.
Well, yeah, I mean, what I've been thinking a lot about lately, is Israel's morale deficit. I think that Netanyahu can continue to duck and weave politically, to shape shift ideologically,
Mm.
and to kind of sidestep the sword of Damocles. But in the end, can he manufacture the will to fight? Because Hamas is parasitic ultimately on the Israeli occupation and on the daily forms of violence that it experiences within that. So Hamas and groups like it will probably only run out of morale when the occupation ends. I think we can assume that. Meanwhile, within Israel, before the ceasefire, there was clear opposition to the Gaza City offensive amongst the public, but also former defense chiefs and amongst the defense establishment. There was unrest within the ranks of reservists,
Yeah.
and there were kind of conscientious objectors being hauled off to prison. And, we learned, well, in the US and in the West, we recently learned in Afghanistan that actually Clausewitz was right, and that the loss of morale is the major decisive factor in war. And so, in that sense, the serious war crimes that Israel is alleged to be committing are probably weakening it strategically,
Mm.
if indeed it translates into a lack of the will to fight. And this may be where the tactical realm meets the strategic one. So right now there's a power vacuum in
Mm.
Gaza. So of course Hamas is going to be challenged by rivals, by criminal gangs, some of them aided and abetted by Israel. If that leads to civil conflict, it would give Israel an excuse to return to Gaza to kind of restore order um, on its border. You know, kind of these hot-headed, recalcitrant, passion-fueled natives need to be policed. But I do continue to wonder if the ground war restarts, how many reservists will want to be part of this kind of human rights abomination in Gaza? And is that where the rubber meets the road in terms of unraveling this right-wing agenda?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I think that the entire reflection that you have around morale is really interesting and not talked about enough, not discussed enough in public discourse. One of the things that is very connected to what you're saying that I've been thinking about is if hostilities resume, who's profiting, right? It's always that sort of return to it's the economy stupid, but you know,
Yeah.
we're in a situation in which there's a general global economy of war. There's massive industrial complexes that are profiting from wars popping up in different places and different hotspots at different intensities, and requiring also different technological means, right? You're an expert of war for profit, so you know that more than most. And I do think that there's an entire sort of dependency loop between that sort of underpins the relationship between the US and Israel that's quite important to not decouple from how the ceasefire is being framed, what is being put in place, how it's being delivered, how it's being implemented. And I think there's an entire profit machine behind this that shouldn't be discounted as a core actor in this conflict because it's not just the Israelis and Palestinians at the end of the day. Um, I wonder if you have thought about how this is translated in terms of even governance within Israel, how the government is being viewed. I mean, we know that Netanyahu had several challenges to his rule, one might say, not least on the judiciary, not so long ago on the question of the Israeli judiciary. So, I mean, I throw the ball back to you. Are any of these national level pressures leverage points that, you know, other countries could use?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the economics actually is probably the more compelling lever, in my view. And the US has done it before. I mean, the US is the superpower, right? And uh, it was a Republican president, actually, George H.W. Bush, who in 1991, he and his Secretary of State, James Baker, they made it clear. So I'm just outlining a historical example, which often comes to mind, or precedent, that if Israel wanted to receive an aid package of $10 billion in loan guarantees, it had to stop using American taxpayer dollars to build Israeli
Mhm.
settlements on Palestinian land. They knew that the peace conference the US was preparing in Madrid would be massively undermined by the prospect of billions of dollars of US aid funding illegal Israeli settlements, and that would certainly alienate the Israeli delegates. So this historical case has led to a massive standoff, actually, and a firestorm on Capitol Hill, where AIPAC essentially tried to bring Bush down, but he triumphed.
Mhm.
And every president, every US president in the 25 years leading up to that had opposed settlements. Yet not one of them took the action that would be certain to uphold US policy, linking American aid to settlements, linking American aid to Israeli policy. And Bush Sr. did that. He refused to capitulate to a client state. And I asked James Baker 20 years ago, which is why I raise it, because I've done some research on it. But I asked what his abiding motivation was for withholding the loan guarantees, despite all of the risks and all of the drama. And he said, because it was the right policy. And I understood that in moral terms, as well as strategic ones, and in terms of the US national interest. So, it wouldn't be unprecedented to introduce some conditionality, but, as they say, or as the ancient Greeks say, no man steps into the same river twice. And I think the US is in a fundamentally different place, and the policy process is perhaps unrecognizable now. And by the way, just to any graduate students that might be listening or watching, a little study of the loan guarantees dispute was my master's thesis some 20 plus years ago. And when Gaza started, I dusted off my research and applied it to the present and published it in foreign policy. So you never know how relevant or your obscure preoccupations may one day become. Just a side note.
Haven't read the thesis version, but I definitely loved the updated version in foreign policy. So thank you for that tidbit of advice. I think it's wonderful. And on the substance, I completely agree with you on, what are the prospects for conditionality of the same level being applied now. I have my own doubts about the willingness of the current US administration to put pressure in the same way that has been done historically, not least because of the general trend of what I would refer to as the personalization of political relationships and alliances that has emerged since January, since the start of this current administration in the US. I mean, everyone watched with sort of grave concern the entire discussions that were going on around the Nobel Peace Prize nominations. And to me, that signals not just the fact that links in foreign policy are much more personal and much more tied to who's the interlocutor on the other side, but also the fact that fundamentally there doesn't seem to be a willingness to stop pleasing the Trump administration side, which I think is worrying not just for Gaza, but also beyond. And perhaps that's a good segue into our next news item, which looks at another escalation in the Levant, which is the one between Israel and Lebanon, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
Over the course of the month of November, first we saw Lebanon announcing that it would file a formal complaint with the UN Security Council, stating that Israel's construction of a border wall constitutes a violation of the Blue Line demarcation. And then just 3 days later, we see an Israeli airstrike on the Lebanese city of Sidon on November 18th, which killed at least 13 people and sort of started a wave of increased operations against Hezbollah-linked locations. The last of which was only 3 days ago, for example, when Israel killed a senior Hezbollah commander in an attack on Beirut's southern suburbs, which comes only 2 days after Lebanon's president had announced that the country had agreed to hold negotiations with Israel. Hezbollah, on their site, confirmed that its chief of staff, Haytham Ali Tabatabai, was among 5 people killed and 28 others wounded in the Israeli strike on Beirut's southern neighborhood on Sunday. Now, obviously, this matters for so many reasons. First of all, Lebanon is attempting to engage international mechanisms despite an ongoing political paralysis and very, very prominent security pressures that it's facing. At the same time, I would say that the strike on Sidon just a few days later was one of the most significant in Lebanon in a while, and that the strike on Beirut most recently confirms that tensions are deepening once again and increases sort of the risk of a multi-front conflict. Now, I sort of look to you for the first reflection on this, which is how does Lebanon's political and economic fragility shape risk exposure, in your view, at this point in time?
I think the Lebanese system in this regard generates a huge and potentially existential conundrum. It seems to me, Roberta, that anyone who expects the Lebanese armed forces, the LAF, to disarm Hezbollah misrepresents the Lebanese system, and it misrepresents Lebanon's recent history. Sure, the LAF is now a hugely popular national institution, in no small part because of the progress made by leaders like General Aoun when he was the chief. He's currently the president. And it's remarkable, actually, that Lebanon's landed on this cohesive national military institution after those years of civil war between militias, right? But we also have to be realistic. confronting Hezbollah militarily, to me, risks civil war in Lebanon, as it does in Gaza, by the way, with Hamas. And it's unlikely that the left can do it anyway, especially while Israel is violating the ceasefire and bombing in the south. That massively shrinks the left's room for maneuver and its ability to domestically, politically build the case for what it's being asked to do. Israel is killing Lebanese nationals with drones on a daily basis. It's bombing deep into Lebanon, far from the border. They don't want rebuilding to happen in the south, so they're bombing cement factories and construction equipment and half-built homes. The IDF is also conducting kind of like maneuvers in northern Galilee, looking like they're kind of readying for an attack. What sort of conditions are these under which to convince anyone to disarm? I do think the Lebanese government can do more, but I do think that they've tried to meet Israel halfway. They've cut off the relationships between Lebanese banks and Hezbollah financial institutions. They've also stopped Irani flights from landing in Beirut. They're trying. But Israel wants the left to disarm Hezbollah, not just south of the Litani River, by the way, but all over Lebanon. That is a priori unachievable. It's unattainable, and it's setting them up for failure, which I think is dangerous for Lebanon.
I completely agree with you. And, in that line, so the Israeli demand that the left be the one to disarm Hezbollah is clearly fraught with contradictions and unrealistic expectations. But sort of in the bigger sense of things, do you think that Israeli demands for Lebanon are fair?
Well, to my mind, it's not a real choice. If pursuing it would lead to ruin, how is that authentic or kind of workable for anyone? So actually, the choices that Israel has laid out to a number of actors to meet feel a lot like Sophie's choices. So, hegemony is all well and good, but you have to be reasonable and to operate with some level of consent. Otherwise, it's just going to be all coercion and therefore all war. Israel is saying to Hamas, disarm and be destroyed by either the IDF or local challengers or whoever, be destroyed, or we're going to start the bombing again. It's saying to the Lebanese president, disarm Hezbollah all over Lebanon, potentially reigniting civil war, or we're going to start the bombing again. It's saying to potential Arab partners in the International Stabilization Force, go in there, disarm Hamas, become embroiled in either an extension of the Israeli occupation or a Palestinian civil war, or you're going to anger Trump. It's saying to neighbors like Jordan, by the way, get on board with this new Israel hegemonic order and eviscerate your own legitimacy domestically, or you're going to lose US support, which is the bedrock of your monarchy. And that's before we talk about all the arm twisting that's going to be involved with the Abraham Accords and, Lebanon, Syria, southern Yemen, you name it. So as I say, I think these are Sophie's choices, which means that your hegemony is neither benign nor benevolent. And I think it will just likely lead to more conflict and instability.
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, are these demands placing Lebanon between a rock and a hard place that the country can't really break out of? I think that I agree with you that it's a bit the case, right? I've also been thinking a lot myself about the internal realities of a system that's structured like Lebanon, a muhassasa system. Thinking whether the reform of the political system and its structure that is sort of being asked almost of the Lebanese government at this point in time is credible amid overall strait fragility, amid sort of a country that's still trying to recover from and to recover, to reconstruct, to rebuild from the first sort of batch of open conflict since 2023 between Israel and Lebanon. One would hope that these escalations of the past few days won't reopen the door for something of that magnitude, but it's very difficult to tell, right? The risk is there. The risk is sort of underpinning a lot of the discussion that we're having right now. Um, I wonder, we're talking a lot about Hezbollah and the role that they play in Lebanon, which is also from sort of a community perspective in certain communities quite large politically and socially, right? How do you think that Hezbollah may respond, and can Iran help them respond in this kind of setup?
I mean, can Iran help. I mean, look, my limited understanding is that some smuggling routes in Syria and Iraq are still functional. Hezbollah, like Hamas, will also look to manufacture its own weapons to replace whatever it gives up. And this year alone, Iran has funneled as much as $1 billion to Hezbollah, according to the US Treasury. So Iran is not, I don't think it's quite the wounded tiger that we're assuming. It's replaced its air defenses and it's now manufacturing new missiles at pace. It's working on a new enrichment site called Pickaxe Mountain. There are conflicting assessments now, but the stockpile of enriched uranium was maybe not destroyed by the 12-day war after all. So Iran is potentially doing what it did before, just now with no negotiations and no oversight. But look, I just want to make this point that more broadly, the Iranian regime experienced the war, I think, very differently from the way that we did. Its takeaways are
Mhm.
very different from what ours are. And I get this speaking to Iranian colleagues who are telling us, look, there's a self-confidence now with which the Iranian establishment is speaking. It was able to recover from the strikes on the 13th of June in half a day. It was able to appoint
Mhm.
successors to assassinated officials within 4 hours, which demonstrates a level of institutionalization. Within 7 hours of the
Mhm.
strikes, the chain of command was operational again. It thinks actually that it forced Israeli rhetoric and Israeli demands to change from unconditional surrender to unconditional ceasefire. And then also, Irani society rallied around the flag to an extent, and the community kind of really kicked in, sharing food and fuel and filling the gaps of the state. So things were tested and they sort of worked. So actually,
Mhm.
the Irani regime does not feel humiliated, is my understanding. And so the caution is that the balance sheet looks different in Tehran, and thus it might look different in southern Beirut.
That's a really interesting point. I completely agree with you on sort of needing to balance out visions of this conflict between different actors. And I think you're completely right in your assessment that they definitely don't feel humiliated by what happened. That there's sort of a renewed a sense of, you know what, we've been preparing for something like this for years, right? And most of the things that we put in place in case it escalated to that level kind of worked. You're right in saying that. So no, I'm completely with you on this, and I think it's definitely food for thought for any decision maker that's looking at the situation in Lebanon and thinking, oh, is there, a realistic pathway in the short term for Hezbollah no longer to be such a big political player in Lebanon? Well, perhaps that's really not the case, and the equation needs to be turned differently to be relevant to the political space in which we are now. I want to turn to the next news item that we have on the agenda, which is sort of, a very, very heavy one that this month of November has brought us. And it's the deepening humanitarian crisis in Sudan and the Sudanese conflict after the fall of El-Fasher. There were major developments reported throughout the first half of this month, following the Rapid Support Forces capture of El-Fasher, which was reported in early November. Displacement surged and famine conditions intensified, including across Darfur. War crimes were uncovered. Inhumane conditions were uncovered in very unspeakable ways. Between November 7th and 10th, the United Nations warned that the war is spiraling completely out of control. Why it matters? Well, obviously, Sudan is experiencing one of the most severe humanitarian disasters in the world. And this is complicated by the reported intervention of foreign actors in Sudan, not for humanitarian or protection purposes, which is really the kind of intervention that we would want foreign actors to have right now. The deepening of this crisis has the potential to spill over and further complexify the geopolitical chessboard across the region. And this can have potential effects on neighboring Libya, Chad, on the Sahel, on Red Sea security, and also the potential to deepen political instability in Egypt. I want to start with something that has been on the minds of a lot of of a lot of scholars of Middle Eastern and North African studies for the past few months, as part of our conversation, Alia, today, which is, in your opinion, why why is there not as much attention paid to the catastrophe in Sudan, as to what's been going on in Gaza?
Fair enough. Like Gaza, I think our collective institutions have been completely dazed in the face of these mass war crimes, regularly and clearly directed at children. I mean, we've had no answer. But in terms of the difference, to my mind, it's that Western publics perceive that their governments are more actively complicit in the atrocities in Gaza. And so they mobilized to demand specific actions like immediately suspending arms sales to Israel, ending diplomatic support to Netanyahu. With Sudan, that complicity is not as keenly felt in the Western public. And so there hasn't been that same grassroots pressure on Western governments to take up political space, talking about the Sudan crisis. And then where there are countries that are more complicit, they don't have publics, they're in the region, they don't have publics that can demonstrate, that can organize, that can make demands, or to even access news that outlines that involvement. So, I think consequently there's been this very menacing silence around Sudan, even as the preventable disaster in El-Fasher was building for months, and despite the very grave threat to our shared humanity. And it definitely is preventable. I think in both Gaza and Sudan, the West has leverage over the perpetrators and their backers. These aren't acts of nature. It's not like a climate disaster or some rogue power like Russia or North Korea that nobody can control. Yet these are burdens that our international society cannot bear. It's striking to me that the liberal world order should be kind of brought to its knees by what is effectively the home team, in a sense, rather than by something completely beyond our control. So I think that, we're in danger of giving up the post-World War II international system and its values. We're in danger of giving that up cheaply, because with the right carrots and the right sticks, Roberta, what's so sad is that I think that all of this was avoidable.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you on all of this, and I completely agree. I think it's always a little bit tricky, right, to talk about things like complicity when something feels a little bit more far removed than the direct involvement of one's own government that perhaps can feel more palpable in terms of bringing about accountability. And, we've seen that come from Italy. I've seen that especially in terms of Gaza and demands that have been made by other Italian nationals regarding sort of holding the Italian government accountable on some of this, right?
That's
One of the
exactly,
things that
sorry, Roberta, but it's the pressure from below. Like Gaza wasn't de facto high on the international agenda among
absolutely.
governments in terms of it was pressure from below that pushed it there. And so, there's that first level failure where the governments have failed to act multilaterally and then individually. But then when you don't have that kind of cushion or that sort of safety net of an invested and outraged citizenry, that's when
Mhm.
the ball just falls, and that's I believe what happened in Sudan was that it was a multi-level failure, and then because we didn't feel that complicity, we weren't as mobilized. Anyway,
Mhm. No, I completely hear you on this. And one other element that I've been thinking about increasingly as I see the horrors in Sudan continue to unfold in front of our very eyes, is perhaps the persistent role of racism in how different audiences view conflict, right? And I've sort of identified it with relation to Sudan in two sort of two sides of the same coin, right? One is the side of, do some deaths matter more than others? Which is a question that is systemic, that also applies to Gaza, that has been called out in terms of how reporting is done on the Ukraine war versus elsewhere. And I think this really, really directly translates into how we're talking about Sudan, and the unspeakable horrors that the Sudanese population is living through right now. And the other side of this coin, that I've been thinking about is, in how we talk about Sudan. There's been a lot of focus on the tragedies that are occurring, and perhaps a little bit less on the root causes and on how we got here, and on explicitly sort of unpacking the chain of perpetration that is underpinning this horrible war. And to me, that's also perhaps one side of the racism coin, right? It's, do we actually care enough about looking into how we got here and why to properly do this exercise, as we've done in many other places across the region over time as different conflicts emerged? So these are two things that have been on my mind for the past few months that I think really need to, like, perhaps would merit their own conversations almost as elements. I mean, I turn to you with perhaps another but very related side of this is, why are there foreign and regional interests in Sudan? Like, let's talk about these root causes and these why questions a little bit, right? What are the interests? Why are they there?
Oh, well, just sort of geopolitically, I mean, Sudan occupies, unfortunately, this tantalizing strategic position on an increasingly strategic continent. Russia understands that very well. It's worth recalling that actually the UAE has overtaken China as the largest investor in Africa. There's a huge bet on Africa's future. So Sudan has this coastline along the Red Sea that links the Med to the Indian Ocean. And so there's the prospect of, you can influence global maritime traffic, you can influence security, you can influence trade through ports and through naval bases. And then it's also a place that's at the crossroads of the Arab world and sub-Saharan Africa, which means that power can be projected in many directions. It's a huge resource as well for things like agriculture and therefore food security and for water and that sort of thing. But if you take, for example, a state like Saudi Arabia, Sudan is crucial for stability in the Red Sea. For a state like Iran, it can use the port of Sudan to send weapons to the Al-Houthi in Yemen. Sudan also has vast gold reserves throughout the country. They're dispersed, which is important for a state like the UAE, which is by far the largest importer officially of Sudanese gold, but also, according to several investigations, the main destination for illicit shipments. And well, Roberta, actually, you will know well the links to Libya and the smuggling corridors, the very profitable ones that take you all the way up to the southern doorstep of Europe, right?
Absolutely. I mean, in the links between Libya and Sudan, and especially between the Libyan armed forces of Khalifa Haftar and the rapid support forces in Sudan, have been known to analysts for quite a while now. But it's true that they've grown, they've intensified, they've consolidated, not least because of the fact that these two entities have a common foreign supporter that sort of underpins their efforts, right? The United Arab Emirates that you've mentioned, rightfully having a lot of sort of very real, very practical stakes in the future of Sudan, has been supporting both of these entities for quite some time. In Libya, in particular, it's been discussed for many years that the UAE had a huge role in sort of creating, not creating, but sort of sponsoring and propping up the Libyan Arab armed forces, and definitely contributed to making them as powerful as they are today. The porous borders between Libya and Sudan have, for years, been hotspots of smuggling, anything from weapons to drugs, and other types of narcotics to gold, even sometimes, and refugees and migrants and human smuggling as well, right? There's all of these dynamics that are sort of occurring in a border that's very difficult to manage, very difficult to control, that remains a key also strategic interest for other actors like the European Union, in general, that perhaps should sort of invest a lot more effort into actually wanting to try to see some stability at that border to prevent a lot of the smuggling and illicit economies from continuing to strengthen their grip on the entire territory in the sort of Libya, Sudan, and almost Libya, Sudan, Egypt triangle, right, of border crossings. So I think you're totally right in your assessment there, and in how it links to broader geopolitics. I think that while it's been sort of established for years that Libya can be viewed as a proxy conflict and as a conflict of very competing and very strong geopolitical interests, this is not necessarily translating yet into the conversation about the war in Sudan. And I think that perhaps it should. It should actually be a very prominent feature of how we talk about the war in Sudan and what's unfolding. Um, and I kind of want to circle back to one of the elements that you were mentioning, which is gold, right?
Yeah.
Um, how is gold fueling the conflict?
I mean, undoubtedly, conflict gold is funded both sides of the war in Sudan, with armed factions actually controlling their own mines. Uh, Seizing a mine has actually been the making of entire militias in the war. Let's not forget that Hameti, the leader of the RSF, was basically a camel herder until he forcibly took a gold mine. So not only gold bankrolls a number of things. It bankrolls fighter loyalty, the smuggling of missiles, of course, and weapons, the purchase of drones. But what
Mhm.
its crucial role is that it gives multiple stakeholders a clear economic interest in the continuation of the war. And ultimately, I mean, I said this to AFP in an interview the other day. They didn't print this sentence, but I thought it was quite good actually, which is there's kind of like a Mobius strip of financial incentives that are
Mhm.
powering them,
Mhm.
right? But actually, when we talk about the cash windfalls behind the war, I think we mustn't forget that the RSF has a very recent history as mercenaries in Yemen and Libya, and this influences much of its behavior, right? The RSF was able to recruit in large numbers because of that mercenary war chest. It had the confidence to challenge the Sudanese armed forces because of that combat experience. And the war crimes, they come so easily because of that kind of detached mercenary mindset. I had a guest on my podcast, Cameron Hudson, and what he really brought out was that the origin story of the RSF wealth was this backstory as mercenary fighters that were
Mhm.
sent out into the region so that they wouldn't make trouble at home. So I really hold up the RSF as a strong example of how mercenaries are inevitably vectors of instability, culminating in Sudan's case in genocide and in crimes that on a daily basis shock the conscience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this. For everyone listening, I do recommend, if you want to hear more about this question, to actually check out the Sudan specific episode of Alia's Guns for Hire podcast, which is a really excellent deep dive into these questions and a lot more. I don't know about you, Alia, but I kind of want to switch to something that's perhaps a little bit better news for the region this month.
Sure,
And
with you.
I kind of, I kind of want to turn to Syria, right? Who this month signed up for the US-led coalition against the Islamic State in the Levant, right? So earlier this month, in the second half of this month, Syria signed up to join the international coalition, which is led by the United States, to combat the Islamic State in the Levant and its coalition of affiliated armed groups. Now, the announcement, which was made by the Syrian Information Minister and other US officials, came shortly after Syrian President al-Shara arrived in Washington and was welcomed at the White House by US President Trump. Now, the agreement is said to be political and until now contains no official formal military components or arrangements to it. But the agreement does make Syria the 90th country to join the coalition, which overall aims to prevent foreign fighters from joining ISIL's ranks and also focuses on eliminating the remaining elements of the group from across the Middle East.
Yeah.
Now, the Syrian leader was praised by Trump during their meeting at the White House as he also secured a 6 month suspension of US sanctions against Syria. Now I turn to you, Alia. How significant is this agreement for the new Syrian government's geopolitical stance and its broader approach to foreign policy a few months into its existence?
Yeah. Look, I have a colleague at the Atlantic Council, Alex Pleatsas, and he was actually talking about this, about Syria joining the coalition for months before it happened. And he really thought about it. And I'm remembering that conversation, and he was excited that it would be more than a signal of intent, of course, in terms of Damascus's commitment to fight jihadism, but it was also that it would open up channels with the West for greater intelligence sharing. There could be cooperation on issues like demining and detainee management, a huge issue. It would provide a legal basis for the US to continue its operations in Syria. But crucially, it would help to reduce friction with Israel and to kind of technically deconflict. So, you know, bluntly, I think that Israel would be bombing or undermining a US counterterrorism partner, recalling that it has bombed Syria something like 700 times since last year, since the fall of Assad, including Syrian troops, by the way, in Sueda, and including the defense ministry in Damascus. So, you know, when Alex told me about this, another thing struck me, and that was the potential for SSR, for security sector reform, which is very much your area, Roberta, but permit me. So the agreement, the joining, can serve as a context potentially to bring together the nascent national army in Syria with the Kurdish-dominated Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, in a kind of
Mhm.
joint enterprise, maybe gradually building trust and interoperability. And actually, around the same time that this was announced, the US announced Operation Flintlock would take place in Libya. Now, this is US AFRICOM's annual Special Forces training exercise. So it's going to take place in the spring in 2026 in Sirte, which is right on the ceasefire line. And the tacit aim, of course, is to bring together both the constellations of armed forces in a divided country towards a shared purpose. Because, of course, the name of the game right now in Syria is to unify the military institutions in Libya and in Syria, actually. So
Absolutely.
this is an area potentially you want, you know, you're sort of itching for a good news story, but this is sort of SSR in motion, if you will, where I think the US can add serious value in the region, actually. But then, of course, with Syria, the question occurs to me that what if Damascus's aim actually is to get the US to ditch the SDF as its counterterrorism partner, which of course would be highly Machiavellian, but which is eminently possible.
Which is also a question we unfortunately do not have the answer to. But, you know, perhaps one can check in with later editions of this podcast to see
But
if this gets
it's something to
figured out.
watch. It's something to watch, and it could go either way.
Absolutely. No, completely agree. And you know me, I always love a good opportunity to talk about SSR and why it's important for the region at large. But I'll pick up your point on this being extremely important in Syria. You know, there's been several moves on that front, including through the dialogues and the agreements between the new government and the SDF, on which there's excellent material available online by key Syrian experts of the question, to which I point all of our listeners. But I would like to sort of make the point that completely you're right in the sense that joining something like this coalition opens up possibilities for the new Syrian government. Coalition politics in general during transitions is a phenomenon that I'm always sort of watching very closely, right? Who you ally yourself with and what coalitions you join usually have a key role in determining things like what kind of pathway one can take for SSR, what kind of models of police transformation or defense reform is the government sort of more attracted to, is usually quite visible in the types of alliances and coalitions it joins as part of its transitional phase. And so I agree with you that there's a certain symbolism of Syria joining the coalition, joining 89 other countries, with an important goal that is also, to a very large degree, quasi-existential for for the new Syrian government, right? In
Mhm.
terms of also its ability to sustain itself, and peace in the country. And one that definitely opens doors in terms of collaboration on things like law enforcement reform, on things like even community policing, if one wants to take a more people-centered approach to the question, and on generally speaking, answering the question of what should we do with the Syrian army politically, but also structurally, right? What are the pathways that we can take in that direction? And speaking of defense and speaking of the Syrian army, I want to probe you on something else, Alia, which is, in your opinion, how does this political agreement interact with military realities on the ground in Syria right now?
Uh, well, the military reality is, of course, that the Syrian armed forces have been cooperating with the US on counter Daesh operations for the last year, and Shara himself has since he fell out with ISIS 10 years ago. But several thousand ISIS fighters remain, mainly in the northeast and in Deir ez-Zor. There are attacks, there are IEDs, kidnappings, they're all increasing. And of course, after Assad fell, they looted arms depots, right? And they still have hundreds of millions of dollars from their golden era in terms of a war chest. So right now, it seems to me that ISIS are sort of essentially waiting for a US drawdown, which they feel will be the game changer to then strike. So that's one military reality. And I think another one is the IDF, of course, ever present. There are common aims with Shara's government, obviously fighting ISIS, foreign fighters, other jihadist groups, but making sure Iran doesn't reestablish a foothold. But of course, there are major differences. Israel currently looks like its strategy in Syria is actually to foster separatism and disunity to keep the country weak and divided. It doesn't want to see a national Syrian military institution emerge, one with advanced air defense systems, a modern air force, long-range missiles, that kind of thing. So, unfortunately, Israel seems to have a vested interest in obstructing and impeding the consolidation of sovereignty, of the state monopoly of the use of force as well, and ultimately, and unfortunately by extension, in disrupting social cohesion in Syria. So that's another military reality. I think the other one, the final one, is the reality. Well, there are others, but that I'll mention is the tensions with the SDF. So the Kurds control like a third of Syria, including the oil and water-rich parts. There's probably no economic diversification, no, sorry, revitalization in Syria without a deal with the Kurds. Now, an armed forces kind of integration deal was signed in March, but that's now imperiled, seemingly. Just last week, Damascus accused the SDF of killing 2 of its soldiers. And one of the main sticking points is about command and whether SDF units can join as whole detachments with their own commanders rather than just as individuals signing up. So you and I, Roberta, were both at the Middle East Peace and Security Forum in Kurdistan last week in Dahuk, where the SDF leader, General Mazloum Abdi, he spoke, and he was quite clear that it's impossible for Syria to remain a centralized state. That was my sort of key takeaway. He also talked about the mutual lack of trust with Damascus. So the evolutions of those discussions and of that relationship in the coming weeks, bearing in mind that we're barreling towards an end of December deadline for this to be sorted out, I think the evolution of that relationship will actually be central to the outlook for Syria.
Yeah, thanks, Alia, for bringing up that aspect. I'm always, you know, I'm always trying to encourage the current situation in Libya and all the problems around military unification being used almost as a cautionary tale in instances like this, right? The deepening divisions don't sort of do anybody any good, especially sort of trying to come out of a transition. And so I do feel that there is a certain there are certain key lessons to be drawn here around the fact that defense reform is a process that needs to be inclusive and that needs to be carried out, yes, with full knowledge of the demands and needs of different parts of different coalitions that have emerged across a given territory, and in this case, Syria, right? But that this still needs to be tied with a general approach to stabilizing Syria, which needs to remain sort of the heart and the core and the priority to move forward. And so one would hope, at least I would hope, that this common goal, which I think is actually echoed fundamentally by different Syrian factions at this point in time, which is we want to be safe and secure and stable and to move ahead, that this remains at the heart of the discussions as a sort of line of sight for where this all needs to go. I also kept thinking as you were talking about Bunyan al-Marsus operations against the Islamic State in Libya back in the mid 2010s, right, which received vast amounts of US, among others, support in its conduct in the day-to-day, which again sort of offers some cautionary tales. One of the things that I'm conscious of and that I'm watching with how Syria joining the anti-ISIL coalition will sort of unfold is I think that responsibility in for operations and for their success. I'm concerned about the full weight of the accountability of success being placed solely on Syria's forces and the new government's forces, and that all of that weight for success doesn't end up falling on a structure that is still transitional, that is still maturing, and that probably isn't ready, structurally speaking, for bearing the full weight of basically being at the front line of stopping the Islamic State from continuing to advance and continuing to progress. And I think, this is a weight that can be very, very difficult to deal with, especially if you're still in a situation, as we were just discussing, of basically trying to talk about how you're going to organize your own house at this point, right? So this is something that I'm sort of conscious of and cautiously watching as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is a dynamic that you also want to add some thoughts on, but over to you.
Yeah, well, I think the final point I make on Syria is that, um, the clouds of every day we see in the media increasingly that these clouds of sectarian violence are lowering over Syria. And there's also the perceived complicity of Damascus aligned forces. This has happened in Alawi and Druze areas with, 800 people dying, 1,000 people dying. And my concern is that into this highly fraught environment where the future of the country is on a knife edge, as you say, disinformation could actually be used by nefarious actors to tip things over. This is a region where most people, when young people get their news from social media, just taking the clashes earlier this year, actually in March in Latakia, generative AI was part of that spark, where it was used to manipulate footage and to alter voices to kind of stoke fear and hatred within both pro-Assad and pro-government communities. Also, the violence south of Damascus in April was catalyzed by a fabricated audio recording attributed to a Druze sheikh, in which he insulted the prophet. Wasn't real. 100 people died. And so the key is that these disinformation campaigns emerged from both within but outside Syria as well. Certainly on the pro-Assad side, bots and paid posters were active in Iraq, funded by pro-Irani militia. And actually, it was a BBC, I think it's a BBC Arabic investigation, found that more than 60% of the social media accounts that were sharing this fake content were based outside of Syria, in Iraq and Iran on one side, and in Turkey and Saudi on the other. So my concern is just that, and I'll end here, is that Syria is probably, it has enough of a challenge with social cohesion already, and we need to closely watch how that might be weaponized from outside its borders using technology and using artificial intelligence.
Thank you so much for this, Alia. It's an excellent point that definitely contributes to everything that we've talked about on Syria so far. And speaking of disinformation, I want to segue to the final news item that you and I are going to be discussing today. which concerns Russia. And so disinformation naturally leads
Yeah,
us right into that. Um,
masterful.
as you very well know, over the past few months, sort of in September, October, and now also this month, November, news reporting revealed that hundreds of young Iraqis have been recruited through social media to fight as mercenaries for Russia in Ukraine. Now, according to investigative findings released on November 5th, recruiters are operating openly across Iraqi social media platforms, luring unemployed young Iraqis with promises of salaries of up to $3,000 a month and other types of benefits that we'll unpack together. Families that are being interviewed for these reports allege that they were misled about the nature of the deployments, and there are several cases of Iraqi recruits being killed in combat that have now been confirmed. This trend highlights a dangerous new layer of vulnerability in Iraq's security and economic landscape, right? The exploitation of youth by foreign actors through digital channels. And it ties very neatly in with your point about disinformation in Syria.
Yeah.
Beyond the human cost of this, the recruitment pipelines are really risking to undermine Baghdad's efforts to stabilize the country and also risk entangling Iraq in external conflicts and exposing it to diplomatic friction with both Russia and Western partners, a friction that Iraq frankly does not need right now. And if left unchecked, this phenomenon could widen existing socioeconomic grievances and fuel further instability at home. As our resident expert on mercenarism, Alia, I, of course, will be turning to you quite a lot for this conversation. But I want to start by asking you, what's the significance of Iraqis now joining the front line in Ukraine?
Well, Roberta, we've seen for years now how the war in Ukraine has sucked in unemployed men from Nepal, from Cuba, from Colombia, from Cameroon, Sudan, Uganda, South Africa, you name it. In fact, a story just broke yesterday that the individual that was leading the recruitment of young South Africans to fight for Russia in Ukraine is Jacob Zuma's daughter, and she was actually shot into the police by her sister. So it's a sort of family anguish kind of story, but it's extraordinary how it reaches to the top of the political elite, and it probably does in Iraq as well. But with Iraqi youth on the front line of war in Europe, for 22 years they've had to navigate and survive invasion, occupation, sectarian warfare, Daesh's brutality, only now to be forced to seek economic opportunity through war in faraway lands. What a position to be in. What a damning indictment on the situation in Iraq. The media has reported that anywhere, Iraqi media, between 2,000 and 5,000 Iraqi mercenaries have left Iraq to fight in Ukraine since 2022. Most of them, we're assuming thus far, for Russia. And if they want to come home, they're caught as POWs, their government isn't going to help them or even acknowledge them, especially if they've taken up the Russian citizenship, which is one of the offerings. The Iraqi government can just wash its hands of them. So some are recruited from within Iraq, and a plane ticket is then bought for them. They tend to leave as tourists in tour groups. But others are Iraqis that ended up in Moscow looking for work. And then there are like ubiquitous QR codes everywhere that you can scan, and then they see this offer of, making it big. And some of these Iraqi young men have become social media influencers, and they're recruiting other Arabs. Mostly, it has to be said, Egyptians and Algerians. So these videos you can find them easily on Instagram and TikTok, and they're saying, we can help you join us. And by the way, here are some phrases that might be useful to start learning, like we're out of ammo, or like, drone incoming, that sort of thing. And one influencer in particular is pretty blunt. He's saying, look, guys, the death rate is 99%. But the problem is so large, and it's so kind of like growing, that the Iraqi government has been forced to come out and reiterate that it's actually neutral in the war in Ukraine. But of course, some non-state actors, armed groups, militias are involved in this lucrative trade in young men. it's not all foreigners that are weaponizing their poverty. The wolves are in Iraq. There are huge brokerage fees, up to half the soldier's monthly salary. There are suspicions that militias and even Iraqi parliamentarians are involved. So the conspiracy runs deep. And as one Iraqi journalist put it, it's turning Iraqi youth into merchandise. And another one wrote, because Iraqi media is so fabulous and their commentators are just fantastic, but another one said, why would anyone choose this fate? Because recruiters promised them what Iraq has never given them: money, land, and a future. So, you know, again, as I say, it's damning and tragic in equal measure.
Thank you. Thank you for the overview. I think Russia really hit the nail on the head when it decided to focus on economic incentives and target countries where they knew these economic incentives would work, right? We're talking about, as I was mentioning earlier, and as you were mentioning earlier, signing bonuses that I've read can go up to $20,000. We're talking about monthly salaries that are nearing $3,000 a month. We're talking about offers of plots of land, Russian passports, pensions, and not just for Iraqis, but for other countries too. I mean, imagine being in Sudan right now and hearing that offer. It's not a stretch to think, okay, this is actually an attractive thing, even if the death rate is 99%. Well, guess what? That's not too far off from the reality here either. And I think this really should be a top concern for authorities in Baghdad. It's if the economic incentive is so strong and can lead to such a huge trend emerging in a very short amount of time, should this be a top reform priority for authorities in Baghdad? I personally think that it should be. And I mean, I want to sort of segue back to you on this, but are there any implications from all this in terms of stability for
Stability,
Iraq?
absolutely. But listen, apart from the trauma and the loss for the families that are contending with these disappearances, and they do disappear, there's no confirmation of death, there's no body. Mothers are left to wonder and to wait and to agonize. But you know, with mercenaries, we often, or I often, talk about the accountability gap, in that it's very difficult to go after them for war crimes, both in terms of domestic and international law, and also the lack of political will. But what we're seeing is that they also open up operational gaps. And a good example of this, a very good illustration, is in Cameroon, where the armed forces are fighting on multiple fronts, including a jihadist insurgency in the north. And we've had so many deserters from the army and the special forces, given the lure of these $3,000 a month contracts, that the government has had to implement a ban on officers leaving the country. So there's that danger. But then, to my mind, we also have the day after dangers, right? What will it mean for stability when some of these combat hardened, skilled fighters, fresh from a high intensity war zone, many levels up from the fighting in Iraq, what happens when they come back? And they might return as individuals, they'll be battle hardened, they'll likely be wanted by the authorities as a deserter if they left their army position, they'll be unable to find work. That's a formula for trouble. And then there's always the possibility that the Russian state will kind of corral them and organize them and bring them back to Africa and the Middle East more formally, with or without their consent, as part of the Africa
Mhm.
Corps, or the successor group of the Wagner Group, to kind of advance the predatory Russian agenda. And who knows, what if Russia gets back into Syria? You know, will it bring them there? So apart from the moral disquiet that this exploitation should give rise to, and this weaponization of poverty should give rise to, in terms of stability alone, it's not good. And I'll stop after this, but I just wanted to end by saying, or asking, why was the practice of mercenary warfare extirpated and outlawed beginning in the 17th century? Why did we move to a system of standing national armies, arguably patriotic? Sure, that is a story about consolidating state power and rulers wanting to have exclusive control over the means of violence. Sure. But alongside was a moral movement that said, we have to end this trade in flesh and blood for gold because it's inhuman. And so, in many ways, I think we should understand this phenomenon as part of the larger kind of systematized inhumanity that's driving the Kremlin in its war in Ukraine. And lo and behold, it's coming for the Arab world.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alia. I think you're definitely correct in mentioning the importance of learning from the past in terms of why mercenarism was outlawed. And I think that there's definitely a trend to watch here, not just for Iraqis and Iraq's future, but for mercenarism in general and what that means and what this type of modality of recruitment, using social media, using these tools, using these very deep economic incentives means for conventional warfare and its future writ large, right? Um, I think on that note, that brings us to the end of this month's regional recap. And I want to thank you so much, Alia, for your insights and your thoughtful analysis. And thank all of our listeners for joining us today. To all of our listeners, please be sure to come back next month for a special year in review. We'll take a step back and reflect on the events, the themes, and the turning points that shaped 2025 as a whole across the MENA region. And on behalf of the Institute for Middle East Options and the entire team, I thank you once again for listening, and we'll see you next time.